This is also a time of change for my family.
The palace did not wake to a rumor. It woke to an order. In one stunning royal command, King Charles moved against the woman who had stood beside him for decades, declaring that Camilla's queen title would be withdrawn from her public standing and transferred in ceremonial authority to Princess Anne immediately. The decision was not quiet. It was not symbolic. It was a rupture inside the crown itself. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles sat alone with the final page in front of him, and for a long moment, he did not reach for the pen. The royal order, a formal instruction from the sovereign that changes how duties, titles, or powers are carried out, named the decision in plain language. Camilla's active queen title privileges were to be withdrawn, and Anne would receive ceremonial authority immediately. Ceremonial authority meant the public role attached to royal events, the power to represent the crown in moments where symbolism mattered almost as much as law. That mattered because Camilla's place had been treated as settled, protected, and beyond challenge. It mattered because removing her did not only change a title, it told the palace that Charles believed the crown itself had reached a breaking point. The king read the wording twice. He moved nothing except his eyes. Then he set the pen down after signing, not with panic, not with rage, but with a terrible calm that made the room feel colder than anger ever could. The phrase, "effective immediately," sat near the bottom of the order like a blade. It meant there would be no delay, no careful public negotiation, no soft bridge for the queen consort to cross before the world understood what had happened. Charles had not issued a warning. He had delivered a verdict, and the monarch knew that once the file left his desk, even he could not pretend this was only a private family matter. Camilla received the news away from the noise of the household, and her face changed before she spoke. She did not ask whether the message was mistaken. She understood too quickly for that. The queen consort's first silence carried humiliation, then disbelief, then something harder. Because the woman who had waited years to stand beside Charles now saw her position being handed to Anne without consultation from her circle. Anne was summoned directly, bypassing every friendly voice that might have slowed the order or softened its force. That detail told the palace everything. Charles wanted no interference. He wanted no delay. And as the first doors began to close, everyone understood this was only the first blow. Because before the confrontation could begin, the palace had to face the people at the center of the storm. Charles, Camilla, Anne, and the future king watching every move. This was never only about a title. It was about loyalty, sacrifice, pride, and the painful question of who had truly protected the monarchy when its walls began to crack. Charles carried the weight of a decision that could destroy his marriage's public image. Camilla faced humiliation. Anne faced unwanted power. William faced the terrifying possibility that the crown was changing shape before his eyes. Charles stopped outside Camilla's room before entering, and the silence around him felt heavier than any argument waiting inside. The king knew he had not simply signed a paper. He had crossed a line between husband and sovereign, between private loyalty and public duty. That mattered because the monarchy could not survive on affection alone. It also mattered because Camilla had spent years believing her place beside him had finally become secure after every scandal, whisper, and public doubt had failed to remove her. Camilla waited inside with her hands folded tightly, already sensing that his quiet face carried no comfort. The queen consort understood the royal order. The king's formal written command changing duties and ceremonial power had already been signed, and that made the wound deeper. She was not being asked, she was being told. Charles looked at her once, then lowered his eyes, because he knew his silence would hurt before his words even arrived. She had fought for acceptance, and now acceptance itself was being pulled away in the name of duty. Anne arrived soon after, controlled and unreadable, but her clenched gloves betrayed the cost of what she had been handed. The Princess Royal did not look proud. She looked burdened. Her new ceremonial authority meant she would now carry the public role attached to major royal events, a role filled with symbolism, pressure, and judgment. Anne understood why that mattered. This was not a prize, but a sign that Charles trusted her restraint more than Camilla's position. William received the news with alarm, not victory. The prince was told the order had already been signed, and he stared at the aide as if the future had moved too quickly. A senior courtier placed 2 folders on the table, one bearing Camilla's name and one bearing Anne's, and the transfer suddenly felt painfully real. Charles had acted. Camilla had been wounded. Anne had been pulled into power. William had seen the crown change shape in one morning. And as each person absorbed the shock, one question began to haunt the palace. What had forced Charles to move so suddenly? The answer was buried, not in the order itself, but in the hidden backstory that made this moment feel inevitable. Every palace crisis has a moment everyone later points to and says, "That was when everything changed." For Charles, that moment came during the private Windsor Thanksgiving ceremony, when Camilla interrupted Anne's tribute to the late Queen and insisted that all future ceremonial references pass through her office first. The room froze. Anne said nothing. Charles saw everything. And from that silence, the order was born. Anne had been speaking with the quiet force that only years of service can give, and everyone in the room understood why that tribute mattered. The Windsor Thanksgiving ceremony was a private royal gathering meant to honor continuity, service, and the late Queen's legacy in front of senior family members. It was not a public performance. It was a family act of remembrance, and that made Camilla's interruption feel sharper, because she did not challenge a schedule. She challenged the meaning of duty itself. The Queen Consort's demand that future ceremonial references pass through her office turned a solemn moment into a test of control. Camilla believed she was protecting order, but the silence that followed told another story. Anne stayed still, yet her lowered eyes carried hurt instead of anger, and that wounded Charles more deeply than any open confrontation could have done. The king watched the woman beside him take command of a moment built around his mother's memory, and something inside him shifted. He did not speak. He did not correct her in front of the family. But the monarch saw clearly that private loyalty was now colliding with royal discipline, and that collision could no longer be ignored. William noticed it before anyone else admitted it. The prince saw his father grip the edge of the chair, a small gesture, almost hidden, but powerful enough to expose the end of patience. He understood that Charles was not merely embarrassed. The future king understood that his father was measuring the cost of silence. The ceremony had been meant to unite the family around legacy, but instead it revealed a dangerous fracture. Camilla wanted authority, Anne carried service, and Charles had to decide which one the crown could trust. Charles acted after the room emptied. According to a documented palace account, later placed inside the private family file, the king asked for the protocol papers that defined queenly ceremonial authority. Protocol meant the rules and customs that guide royal roles during official duties, and those papers gave him the path he needed. One interruption had become the hidden spark behind the royal order. But Camilla would not accept that one ceremony had cost her everything, and when she finally stood before Charles, the pain of that ceremony returned as a weapon neither of them could avoid. When Camilla entered the private audience room, she did not look defeated. She looked betrayed. Charles was already standing near the table, the signed order resting between them like a verdict. No aides softened the moment. No private secretary translated the pain into polite language. It was husband against wife, sovereign against consort, and every word carried the sound of something breaking. Camilla stopped before the table and looked at the folder as if it had been placed there to shame her. The private audience room was a closed royal meeting space where serious personal or official matters could be discussed, without staff guiding the words. That mattered because no advisor could protect Charles from her pain, and no courtier could soften the truth for the queen consort. She understood the order had already taken effect. She was not asking for time. She was challenging the right of the king to turn years of loyalty into one signed command. Charles held his ground, but the cost showed in his face. Camilla asked whether decades beside him could be erased with one signature, and he struggled to answer without looking away. The king knew her question was personal, but his answer had to be royal. He told her the crown could not survive if service became entitlement, and the words landed harder than anger. The queen consort's expression changed at once. Her fury cracked into shock, because she heard what he was really saying. This was not only about a title, it was about trust. Camilla stepped closer, but Charles did not retreat. In a recorded private conversation preserved in the family file, the monarch revealed why Anne's name had been chosen. The Princess Royal had never asked for the title, never chased attention, and never treated duty as possession. That was why the decision mattered. Anne's authority would calm the institution, while Camilla's fight for control had begun to threaten it. The king did not speak cruelly, but every calm word cut deeper because it sounded final. Camilla touched the edge of the folder with 2 fingers and pushed it away. She refused to open it. She refused to accept the order as something worthy of her hands. The gesture was small, but the rejection was unmistakable. Charles watched her push away the paper that had changed both of their lives, and for one breath, husband and sovereign looked equally wounded. Yet the confrontation exposed something even deeper. The king had not acted alone. Behind the monarch's signature stood a quiet circle of power, and one person in particular understood exactly why Anne had become the only answer. William did not need to raise his voice to change the course of the monarchy. His influence was colder than anger and heavier than accusation. While Charles carried the authority to sign the order, William carried the future that would inherit its consequences. In a private meeting before dawn, the prince made one thing clear. The crown could no longer afford confusion about who represented duty and who represented damage. William stood before his father with a restraint that made the moment more dangerous, not less. The future king was not asking for revenge against Camilla. He was thinking about the monarchy after Charles, the years ahead, when every symbol would be tested, every choice measured, every weakness used against the crown. That mattered because a royal title was not just a form of address. It was a public sign of trust, duty, and national meaning. It also mattered because Anne had spent a lifetime proving discipline without demanding reward, while the queen consort now stood at the center of a crisis that could no longer be hidden. Charles listened without interrupting. The king removed his glasses, rubbed his eyes, and looked suddenly less like a monarch than a tired father being asked to wound his own household. William chose each word carefully, because he knew the pain he was placing in front of him. The prince said that if Camilla remained the symbolic center, the monarchy risked confusing loyalty to Charles with loyalty to the crown. That single sentence changed the room. The monarch understood the difference at once, and that difference was the heart of the decision. Anne's name carried a weight no speech could create. The Princess Royal had not chased attention, had not built a court around herself, and had not treated royal duty like private property. Her reputation gave the order moral force inside the family, because even those who feared the transfer could not easily question her service. Charles knew this. William knew it too, and in that private meeting, father and son faced the brutal truth that the safest person for the crown was the one who had never asked to be placed above anyone. William then placed a sealed memorandum on the table. The memorandum, a private written note used to confirm advice, authority, or procedure, stated that ceremonial authority could be reassigned immediately under sovereign instruction. Charles did not reach for it at first. Then he did. The king had the mechanism. The prince had given him the argument. Anne had become the answer. And with power now redirected toward her, the palace machinery began moving fast, because the first consequences did not arrive through speeches or headlines. They arrived through doors closing, names being removed, and Camilla seeing the new reality in silence. The fallout began with small things that felt enormous. A nameplate was removed. A seating chart was rewritten. A ceremonial briefing was collected before Camilla could read it. Nothing was shouted, yet everything screamed. For the first time, she was not being prepared as the central royal woman beside Charles. She was being managed around, carefully, politely, and with devastating finality. Camilla stood near the table as a courtier lifted her folder from the top of the briefing pile and replaced it with Anne's. The queen consort said nothing, but silence did not mean acceptance. The ceremonial briefing, a set of notes that tells royals where to stand, what role to take, and how an event should unfold, now carried someone else's name in the place where hers had always been expected. That mattered, because these papers were not just schedules. They were the palace's way of showing who held trust, who carried authority, and who stood nearest to the crown in public life. Charles heard the change had already been carried out, and the king felt the cost land harder than the signature itself. His order left no gray area, no temporary pause, no soft arrangement that staff could interpret gently. The monarchy obeyed clear commands quickly because delay created weakness, and weakness invited rebellion. Yet the speed of obedience hurt him. Charles had chosen the crown, but now he had to watch that choice move through rooms, hands, files, and faces until it reached the woman he had once promised to protect. Anne received the new authority with restraint, not satisfaction. The Princess Royal refused any public celebration and told her staff in a documented office instruction that no one was to treat Camilla's humiliation as victory. That instruction mattered because Anne understood the danger of appearing hungry for power. She also understood that the crown could not heal if one woman's fall became another woman's parade. Her discipline made the transfer more powerful because it showed the palace exactly why Charles had trusted her in the first place. Camilla saw the next blow arrive in an altered invitation list. One event she had expected to lead was reassigned to Anne within the hour, and the Queen Consort's name dropped lower on the page with a quiet cruelty no speech could match. Charles had changed the title, staff had changed the machinery, Anne had changed the tone by refusing triumph. Yet that restraint created the next turning point, because the Princess Royal chose to face Camilla not as a rival, but as a woman carrying unwanted authority. When the palace expected triumph, Anne chose something far more dangerous, a private conversation that stripped the crisis down to its human truth. Anne did not enter Camilla's room like a winner. She entered like someone who understood that victory can still feel like grief. There were no secretaries, no witnesses, no polished phrases prepared for public survival. Camilla sat rigidly by the window. Anne remained standing for a moment, then placed the royal folder on the table between them without opening it. The silence said more than accusation ever could. Camilla looked at the folder first, then at Anne, and the pain in her face hardened into pride. The royal folder held the signed order and the revised duties connected to the Queen title transfer, meaning the public role once attached to Camilla would now pass into Anne's hands. That mattered because this was no longer a palace rumor or a private insult. It was written, organized, and ready to be carried into royal life. It also mattered because no advisor stood between them. No one could turn pain into policy. No one could make humiliation sound polite. Anne spoke first, and her voice stayed low. The Princess Royal made clear that she had not requested the transfer, had not asked Charles for the authority, and would not use the title for personal elevation. Camilla listened, but her anger did not soften. The Queen Consort asked whether Anne had come to enjoy the defeat, and the question struck the room like broken glass. Anne answered without cruelty. Humiliation was not service. Power taken from one woman did not become noble just because another woman carried it quietly. Camilla looked away then, but Anne did not let the truth pass untouched. The Princess Royal admitted the order hurt everyone, including Charles, and that forced the Queen Consort to face a pain larger than her own public fall. The king had wounded his marriage, wounded his household, and wounded himself because he believed the crown had reached a dangerous point. Anne warned that the monarchy survives only when its symbols are trusted. A symbol meant more than a person's title. It was the image people believed represented duty, restraint, and national stability. Charles believed that trust had been damaged, and once the monarch believed that, resistance could not reverse the order. Camilla finally touched the folder. She did not open it. She did not accept it. But her fingers rested on the cover long enough to show that she understood the finality of what had happened. Anne watched without triumph, and the silence between them changed shape. It was no longer only anger. It was grief, pride, and the terrible knowledge that the palace had crossed into history. The private storm settled into public consequence, because what had begun behind palace doors now belonged to the world, and the public reaction turned one royal order into a national reckoning. By sunrise, Britain did not need palace confirmation to understand the scale of the rupture. One front page captured it perfectly. A black and white photograph of Camilla, beside the headline, "Queen title passes to Anne. Charles ends an era." Outside Buckingham Palace, a small crowd gathered in stunned silence, phones raised, faces tense, as if the monarchy had shifted beneath their feet overnight. Charles watched the morning coverage alone, and the king looked older before the first broadcast ended. The front page had turned a private royal order into a national spectacle, because the public could now see the wound that palace walls had failed to hide. A royal restructuring meant a major change in who carries public duties, titles, and ceremonial power inside the monarchy. That mattered because this was not a minor schedule change. It reshaped the meaning of Camilla's place beside him, and gave Anne a role the country instantly understood as a judgment. Camilla saw her own image printed beneath the headline, and folded the newspaper slowly. The queen consort did not let her staff see her hands tremble, but the room felt the damage anyway. She had survived years of public anger, years of doubt, years of being judged through the shadow of the past. Now the humiliation was clean, official, and impossible to soften. Broadcasters called it the most dramatic internal change of Charles's reign, because it touched marriage, duty, succession, and trust all at once. A presenter on the morning program gave the country the sentence that defined the day. "This is not a reshuffle. This is a royal judgment." The words moved quickly, repeated on screens, in papers, and across every conversation outside the palace gates. A reshuffle meant a simple change of roles, but judgment meant blame, consequence, and moral weight. That distinction mattered. It made the public stop asking who had gained power, and start asking why the crown believed Camilla could no longer carry it. Anne's name divided the crowd, but steadied the story. Some people outside Buckingham Palace felt sympathy for Camilla, seeing a woman publicly reduced after standing beside Charles for decades. Others admired Anne's service, saying the Princess Royal had earned trust by never demanding attention. That divide proved the order had emotional force far beyond the family. Charles had made the decision. Camilla had become its public face, and Anne had become its symbol. But once the noise began to fade, the monarchy still had to decide what this moment truly meant: punishment, correction, or painful renewal. And in the final reckoning, the answer was not found in the headlines, but in what each person lost, accepted, and finally became. In the end, the order did not simply strip Camilla of power or lift Anne into history. It revealed the oldest truth of monarchy: love may stand near the throne, but duty sits on it. Charles made the decision no husband wanted to make, and no sovereign could avoid. Camilla lost the certainty she thought she had earned. Anne accepted a burden she never chased. Charles met Camilla after the public storm had burned through every headline, and the king spoke with the quiet exhaustion of a man who could no longer soften the truth. The title transfer was not a temporary family quarrel. It was a correction of royal symbolism, meaning the public signs, titles, and ceremonial roles that tell the country who represents stability. That mattered because the crown could not survive if its symbols looked confused. It also mattered because Camilla's position had become more than personal. It had become a question of trust. Camilla listened without interrupting, and that silence showed how much had changed. The queen consort did not forgive Charles in words, but she stopped arguing, and that restraint carried its own verdict. He told her the decision had been made for the crown, not against their past. She looked at him long enough to understand the difference, even if the wound remained. Charles had chosen the institution over comfort, and Camilla had become the cost of that choice. Anne accepted the new ceremonial authority without celebration, and William saw it happen with a stillness that confirmed everything. Ceremonial authority meant the right to stand in the public role once linked to Camilla during key royal events, and Anne carried it like a duty, not a prize. The Princess Royal asked for no praise, No grand statement, no moment of triumph. That mattered because her restraint proved why the transfer had happened in the first place. The monarchy's future would be built around discipline over drama, service over possession, and quiet strength over wounded pride. William later saw the final ceremonial schedule, and the prince understood the permanence of what had been done. Anne's name now stood where Camilla's had once been placed, and no one in the room pretended it was symbolic only. Charles had acted. Camilla had fallen from certainty. Anne had become the symbol of repair. The crown did not emerge untouched, but it emerged clearer, and from that clarity came the final verdict. The monarchy had chosen duty, and everyone inside it had paid the price. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.